Hey, JCCEB family, and anyone else who's joining us from their homes or their beds or their couches or their laptops or computers or phones. Hopefully you all are inside because it is super smoky out there and we want you to be healthy and breathing semi-clean air from inside your home. We are going to get started with, sorry, I got my hair, glasses stuck in my hair. Okay, Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. We are on chapter 6. If you're using the PDF, that is on page 65. We're going to do chapter 6 and chapter 7 today. We've got the time, so get ready to rock and roll. And before we get started, as always, we'll do a quick round of our vocal actors or vlactors. So we have, first and foremost, we've got Lana, as always, as our narrator. We've got Crystal playing Mrs. Weasley, Bill, Ginny, the Muggle, aka Mr. Roberts, the Ministry Wizard, and Barty Crouch. We've got Leo playing Amos Diggory, Cedric's dad, Basil, Archie, Ludo Bagman, and Percy. Dean will be playing Mr. Weasley, Charlie, George, and Seamus. Rachel will be playing Hermione. Sam will be playing Ron and Fred. And I'm Miss Summer, and I'll be playing Harry Potter. And with that being said, chapter 6, Lana, let's take it away.
Yeah. All right, chapter 6, the port key. Harry felt as though he had barely lain down to sleep in Ron's room when he was being shaken awake by Mrs. Weasley.
Miss Weasley?
Time to go, Harry dear,
she whispered, moving away to wake Ron. Harry felt around for his glasses, put them on, and sat up. It was still dark outside. Ron muttered indistinctly as his mother roused him. At the foot of Harry's mattress, he saw two large, disheveled shapes emerging from tangles of blankets.
Time already?
Said Fred groggily. They dressed in silence, too sleepy to talk, then, yawning and stretching, the four of them headed downstairs into the kitchen. Mrs. Weasley was stirring the contents of a large pot on the stove, while Mr. Weasley was sitting at the table, checking a sheaf of large parchment tickets. He looked up as the boys entered and spread his arms so they could see his clothes more clearly. He was wearing what appeared to be a golfing sweater and a very old pair of jeans, slightly too big for him, and held up with a thick leather belt.
What do you think?
He asked anxiously.
We're supposed to go incognito. Do I look like a muggle, Harry?
Yeah,
Said Harry, smiling.
very good.
Where's Bill and Charlie and Percy?
Said George, failing to stifle a large yawn.
No.
well, they're apparating, aren't they?
Said Mrs. Weasley, heaving the large pot over to the table and starting to ladle porridge into bowls.
So they can have a bit of a lie-in.
Harry knew that apparating meant disappearing from one place and reappearing almost instantly in another, but had never known any Hogwarts student to do it and understood that it was very difficult.
So they're still in bed.
Said Fred grumpily, pulling his bowl of porridge toward him.
Why can't we apparate too?
Because you're not of age and you haven't passed your test.
Snapped Mrs. Weasley.
And where have those girls got to?
She bustled out of the kitchen, and they heard her climbing the stairs.
You have to pass a test to apparate.
Harry asked.
Oh, yes.
Said Mr. Weasley, tucking the ticket safely into the back pocket of his jeans.
The Department of Magical Transportation has had to fine a couple of people the other day for apparating without a license. It's not easy apparation, and when it's not done properly, it can lead to nasty complications. This pair I'm talking about went and splinched themselves.
Everyone around the table, except Harry, winced.
Splinched?
Said Harry.
They left half of themselves behind.
Said Mr. Weasley, now spooning large amounts of treacle onto his porridge.
So, of course, they were stuck. Couldn't move either way. Had to wait for the accidental magical retrieval squad to sort them out. Meant a fair old bit of paperwork, I can tell you, with the muggles who spotted the body parts they'd left behind.
Harry had a sudden vision of a pair of legs and an eyeball lying abandoned on the pavement of Privet Drive.
Were they okay?
He asked, startled.
Oh, yes,
Said Mr. Weasley matter-of-factly.
but they got a heavy fine, and I don't think they'll be trying it again in a hurry. You don't mess around with apparition. There are plenty of adult wizards who don't bother with it, prefer brooms, slower but safer.
But Bill and Charlie and Percy can all do it.
Charlie had to take the test twice.
Said Fred, grinning.
He failed the first time. Apparated 5 miles south of where he meant to, right on top of some poor old dear doing his shopping, remember?
Yes, well, he passed the second time.
Said Mrs. Weasley, marching back into the kitchen amid hearty snickers.
Percy only passed 2 weeks ago.
Said George.
He's been apparating downstairs every morning since, just to prove he can.
There were footsteps down the passageway, and Hermione and Ginny came into the kitchen, both looking pale and drowsy.
Why do we have to be up so early?
Ginny said, rubbing her eyes and sitting down at the table.
We've got a bit of a walk.
Said
Walk?
Mr. Weasley.
Walk?
Said Harry.
What? Are we walking to the World Cup?
No, that's miles away.
Said Mr. Weasley, smiling.
We only need to walk a short way. It's just that it's very difficult for a large number of wizards to congregate without attracting muggle attention. We have to be very careful about how we travel at the best of times, and on a huge occasion like the Quidditch World Cup.
George!
Said Mrs. Weasley sharply, and they all jumped.
What?
Said George, in an innocent tone that deceived nobody.
What is that in your pocket?
Nothing!
Don't you lie to me.
Mrs. Weasley pointed her wand at George's pocket and said,
Accio.
Several small, brightly colored objects zoomed out of George's pocket. He made a grab for them, but missed, and they sped right into Mrs. Weasley's outstretched hand.
We told you to destroy them.
Said Mrs. Weasley furiously, holding up what were unmistakably more tongue toffees.
We told you to get rid of the lot. Empty your pockets. Go on, both of you.
It was an unpleasant scene. The twins had evidently been trying to smuggle as many toffees out of the house as possible, and it was only by using her summoning charm that Mrs. Weasley managed to find them all.
Accio, Accio, Accio.
She shouted, and toffees zoomed from all sorts of unlikely places, including the lining of George's jacket and the turn-ups of Fred's jeans.
We spent 6 months developing those.
Fred shouted at his mother as she threw the toffees away.
Oh, a fine way to spend 6 months.
She shrieked.
No wonder you didn't get more owls.
All in all, the atmosphere was not very friendly as they took their departure. Mrs. Weasley was still glowering as she kissed Mr. Weasley on the cheek, though not as nearly as much as the twins, who each hoisted their rucksacks onto their backs and walked out without a word to her.
Well, have a lovely time.
Said Mrs. Weasley.
And behave yourselves.
She called after the twins retreating backs, but they did not look back or answer.
I'll send Bill, Charlie, and Percy along around midday.
Mrs. Weasley said to Mr. Weasley as he, Harry, Ron, Hermione, and Ginny set off across the dark yard after Fred and George. It was chilly, and the moon was still out. Only a dull greenish tinge along the horizon to their right showed that daybreak was drawing closer. Harry, having been thinking about thousands of wizards speeding toward the Quidditch World Cup, sped up to walk with Mr. Weasley.
So how does everyone get there without all the muggles noticing?
He asked.
It's been a massive organizational problem.
Sighed Mr. Weasley.
The trouble is, about 100,000 wizards turn up at the World Cup, of course. We just haven't got a magical site big enough to accommodate them all. There are places muggles can't penetrate, but imagine trying to pack 100,000 wizards into Diagon Alley or Platform 9 3/4. So we had to find a nice disordered moor and set up as many anti-muggle precautions as possible. The whole ministry's been working on it for months. First, of course, we had to stagger the arrivals. People with cheaper tickets have to arrive 2 weeks beforehand. A limited number of Muggle transport, but we can't have too many clogging up their buses and trains. Remember, wizards are coming from all over the world. Some apparate, of course, but we have to set up safe points for them to appear. Well, away from Muggles. I believe there's a handy wood they're using as an apparition point. For those who don't want to apparate or can't, we use portkeys. They're objects that are used to transport wizards from one spot to another at a prearranged time. You can do large groups at a time if you need to. There have been 200 portkeys placed at strategic points around Britain, and the nearest one to us is at the top of Stoatshead Hill. So that's where we're headed.
Mr. Weasley pointed ahead of them, where a large black mass rose beyond the village of Ottery St. Catchpole.
What sort of objects are portkeys?
Said Harry curiously.
Well, they can be anything.
Said Mr. Weasley.
Unobtrusive things, obviously, so Muggles don't go picking them up and playing with them. Stuff they'll think is litter.
They trudged down the dark, dank lane toward the village, the silence broken only by their footsteps. The sky lightened very slowly as they made their way through the village, its inky blackness diluting to deepest blue. Harry's hands and feet were freezing. Mr. Weasley kept checking his watch. They didn't have breath to spare for talking as they began to climb Stoatshead Hill, stumbling occasionally in hidden rabbit holes, slipping on thick black tuffets of grass. Each breath Harry took was sharp in his chest, and his legs were starting to seize up when at last his feet found level ground.
Phew.
Panted Mr. Weasley, taking off his glasses and wiping them on his sweater.
Well, we've made good time. We've got 10 minutes.
Hermione came over the crest of the hill last, clutching a stitch in her side.
Now that we just need the portkey.
Said Mr. Weasley, replacing his glasses and squinting around at the ground.
It won't be big. Come on.
They spread out searching. They had only been at it for a couple of minutes, however, when a shout rent the still air.
Over here, Arthur. Over here, son. We've got it.
Two tall figures were silhouetted against the starry sky on the other side of the hilltop.
Vamos!
Said Mr. Weasley, smiling as he strode over to the man who had shouted. The rest of them followed. Mr. Weasley was shaking hands with a ruddy-faced wizard with a scrubby brown beard who was holding a moldy-looking old boot in his other hand.
This is Amos Diggory, everybody.
Said Mr. Weasley.
He works for the Department of the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. And I think you know his son, Cedric?
Cedric Diggory was an extremely handsome boy of around 17. He was captain and seeker of the Hufflepuff House Quidditch team at Hogwarts.
Hi.
There you go.
Said Cedric, looking around at them all. Everybody said hi back except Fred and George, who merely nodded. They had never quite forgiven Cedric for beating their team Gryffindor in the first Quidditch match of the previous year.
Long walk, Arthur.
Cedric's father asked.
Oh, not too bad.
Said Mr. Weasley.
We live just on the other side of the village there. You?
Had to get up at 2, didn't we, Ced? I tell you, I'll be glad when he's got his apparition test. Still, not complaining. Quidditch World Cup wouldn't miss it for a sack full of galleons, and the tickets cost about that. Mind you, looks like I got off easy.
Amos Diggory peered good-naturedly around at the three Weasley boys, Harry, Hermione, and Ginny.
All these yours, Arthur?
Oh, no, only the redheads.
Said Mr. Weasley, pointing out his children.
This is Hermione, friend of Ron's, and Harry, another friend.
Merlin's beard.
Said Amos Diggory, his eyes widening.
Harry Potter.
Harry.
Yeah.
Said Harry. Harry was used to people looking curiously at him when they met him, used to the way their eyes moved at once to the lightning scar on his forehead, but it always made him feel uncomfortable.
Ced talked about you, of course.
Said Amos Diggory.
Told us about playing against you last year. I said, that'll be something to tell your grandchildren, that will. You beat Harry Potter.
Harry couldn't think of any reply to this, so he remained silent. Fred and George were both scowling again. Cedric looked slightly embarrassed.
Harry fell off his broom, Dad.
He muttered.
I told you, it was an accident.
Yes, but you didn't fall off, did you?
Roared Amos. Is it Amish?
Amos.
Okay.
Amos.
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 Amos genially
Fantastic
slapping
cookies.
his son on the back.
Always modest, thou said. Always a gentleman. But the best man won. I'm sure Harry'd say the same, wouldn't you, eh? One falls off his broom, one stays on. You don't need to be a genius to tell me which one's the better flyer.
Must be nearly time.
Said Mr. Weasley quickly, pulling out his watch again.
Do you know whether we're waiting for any more, Amos?
No, the Lovegoods have been there for a week already, and the Fawcett's couldn't get tickets.
Said Mr. Diggory.
There aren't any more of us in this area, are there?
Not that I know of.
Said Mr. Weasley.
Yes, it's a minute off. We'd better get going.
He looked around at Harry and Hermione.
You need to touch the portkey. That's all. A finger'll do.
With difficulty, owing to their bulky backpacks, the 9 of them crowded around the old boot held out by Amos Diggory. They stood there, in a tight circle, as chill breeze swept over the hilltop. Nobody spoke. It suddenly occurred to Harry how odd this would look if a muggle were to walk up here right now. 9 people, 2 of them grown men, clutching this manky old boot in the semi-darkness, waiting.
3,
Muttered Mr. Weasley, one eye still on his watch.
2, 1.
It happened immediately. Harry felt as though a hook just behind his navel had been suddenly jerked irresistibly forward. His feet left the ground. He could feel Ron and Hermione on either side of him, their shoulders banging into his. They were all speeding forward in a howl of wind and swirling color. His forefinger was stuck to the boot as though it was pulling him magnetically onward, and then his feet slammed into the ground. Ron staggered into him, and he fell over. The portkey hit the ground near his head with a heavy thud. Harry looked up. Mr. Weasley, Mr. Diggory, and Cedric were still standing, though looking very windswept. Everyone else was on the ground.
7 past 5 from Stoathead Hill.
Said a voice.
Thanks for coming, everybody. Chapter 6.
Nope.
Oh,
Here we
nope.
go.
Never
Nope,
mind.
keep going.
Chapter 7, Bagman and Crouch. Harry disentangled himself from Ron and got to his feet. They had arrived on what appeared to be a deserted stretch of misty moor. In front of them was a pair of tired and grumpy-looking wizards, one of whom was holding a large gold watch, the other a thick roll of parchment and a quill. Both were dressed as muggles, though very inexpertly. The man with a watch wore a tweed suit with thigh-length galoshes, his colleague a kilt and a poncho.
Morning, Basil.
Said Mr. Weasley, picking up the boot and handing it to the kilted wizard, who threw it into a large box of used portkeys beside him. Harry could see an old newspaper, an empty drinks can, and a punctured football.
Hello there, Arthur.
Said Basil warily.
Not on duty, eh? It's all right for some. We've been here all night. You'd better get out of the way. We got a big party coming in from the Black Forest at 5:15. Hang on. I'll find your campsite. Weasley.
He consulted his parchment list.
About a quarter of a mile's walk over there. First field you come to. Site manager's called Mr. Robert Diggory. Second field. Ask for Mr. Payne.
Thanks, Basil.
Said Mr. Weasley, and he beckoned everyone to follow him. They set off across the deserted moor, unable to make out much through the mist. After about 20 minutes, a small stone cottage next to a gate swam into view. Beyond it, Harry could just make out the ghostly shapes of hundreds and hundreds of tents, rising up the gentle slope of a large field toward a dark wood on the horizon. They said goodbye to the Diggorys and approached the cottage door. A man was standing in the doorway, looking out at the tents. Harry knew at a glance that this was the only real muggle for several acres. When he heard their footsteps, he turned his head, looking at them.
Morning.
Said Mr. Weasley brightly.
Morning.
Said the muggle.
Would you be Mr. Roberts?
I would.
said Mr. Roberts.
And who are you?
Weasley, 2 tents, booked a couple days ago.
I.
Said Mr. Roberts, consulting a list tacked to the door.
You've got a space up by the wood there. Just the one night.
That's it.
Said Mr. Weasley.
You'll be paying now then.
Said Mr. Roberts.
Ah, right. Certainly.
Said Mr. Weasley. He retreated a short distance from the cottage and beckoned Harry toward him.
Help me, Harry.
He muttered, pulling a roll of muggle money from his pocket and starting to peel the notes apart.
This one's a 10? Yes, I see the little number on it now. Good. This is a 5.
A 20.
Harry corrected him in an undertone, uncomfortably aware of Mr. Roberts trying to catch every word.
Yes, so it is. I don't know these little bits of paper.
You're foreign?
Said Mr. Roberts, as Mr. Weasley returned with the correct notes.
Foreign?
Repeated Mr. Weasley, puzzled.
You're not the first one who's had trouble with money.
Said Mr. Roberts, scrutinizing Mr. Weasley closely.
I had to try and pay me with great gold coins the size of hubcaps 10 minutes ago.
Did you really?
Said Mr. Weasley nervously. Mr. Roberts rummaged around in a tin for some change.
Never been this crowded?
He said suddenly, looking out over the misty field again.
Hundreds of pre-bookings. People usually just turn up.
Is that right?
Said Mr. Weasley, his hand held out for the change, but Mr. Roberts didn't give it to him.
He
said thoughtfully.
People from all over. Loads of foreigners. Not just foreigners. Weirdos, you know. There's a bloke walking around in a kilt and a poncho.
Shouldn't he?
Said Mr. Weasley anxiously.
It looks like some sort of, like some sort of rally.
Said Mr. Roberts.
They all seem to know each other, like a big party.
At that moment, a wizard in +4s appeared out of thin air next to Mr. Roberts' front door.
Obliviate!
He said sharply, pointing his wand at Mr. Roberts. Instantly, Mr. Roberts' eyes slid out of focus. His brows unknitted, and a look of dreamy unconcern fell over his face. Harry recognized the symptoms of one who had just had his memory modified.
A map of the campsite for you.
Mr. Roberts said placidly to Mr. Weasley.
And your change.
Said Miss... Oh.
Thanks very much.
Said Mr. Weasley. The wizard in +4s accompanied them to the gate to the campsite. He looked exhausted. His chin was blue with stubble, and there were deep purple shadows under his eyes. Once out of earshot of Mr. Roberts, he muttered to Mr. Weasley.
Been having a lot of trouble with him. Needs memory charm 10 times a day to keep him happy. And Ludo Bagman's not helping. Trotting around talking about bludgers and quaffles at the top of his voice. Not to worry about anti-muggle security. Blimey, I'd be glad when this is over. See you later, Arthur.
He disapparated.
Ginny.
I thought Mr. Bagman was head of magical games and sports.
Said Ginny, looking surprised.
He should know better than to talk about bludgers near muggles, shouldn't he?
He should.
Said Mr. Weasley, smiling and leading them through the gates into the campsite.
But Ludo's always been a bit, lax about security. Yeah, you couldn't wish for a more enthusiastic head of the sports department, though. He played Quidditch for England himself, you know. And he was the best beater the Wimborne Wasps ever had.
They trudged up the misty field between long rows of tents. Most looked almost ordinary. Their owners had tried to make them as muggle-like as possible, but had slipped up by adding chimneys or bell pulls or weather vanes. However, here and there was a tent so obviously magical that Harry could hardly be surprised that Mr. Roberts was getting suspicious. Halfway up the field stood an extravagant confection of striped silk, like a miniature palace, with several live peacocks tethered at the entrance. A little further on, they passed a tent that had 3 floors and several turrets. And a short way beyond that was a tent that had a front garden attached, complete with bird bath, sundial, and fountain.
Always the same.
Said Mr. Weasley, smiling.
We can't resist showing off when we get together. Ah, here we are. Look, this is us.
They had reached the very edge of the wood at the top of the field, and here was an empty space, with a small sign hammered into the ground that read Weasley.
Couldn't have a better spot,
said Mr. Weasley happily.
The field is just on the other side of the wood there. We're as close as we could be.
He hoisted his backpack from his shoulders.
Right,
he said excitedly.
No magic allowed, strictly speaking, but when we're out in these numbers on Muggleland, not when we're out in these numbers on Muggleland, we'll be putting these tents up by hand. Shouldn't be too difficult. Muggles do it all the time. Here, Harry, where do you reckon we should start?
Harry had never been camping in his life. The Dursleys had never taken him on any kind of holiday, preferring to leave him with Miss Fig, an old neighbor. However, he and Hermione worked out where most of the poles and pegs should go, and though Mr. Weasley was more of a hindrance than a help because he got thoroughly overexcited when it came to using the mallet, they finally managed to erect a pair of shabby 2-man tents. All of them stood back to admire their handiwork. Nobody looking at these tents would guess they belonged to wizards, Harry thought. But the trouble was, once Bill, Charlie, and Percy arrived, they would be a party of 10. Hermione seemed to have spotted this problem too. She gave Harry a quizzical look as Mr. Weasley dropped to his hands and knees and entered the first tent.
We'll be a bit cramped,
he called.
But I think we'll all squeeze in. Come and have a look.
Harry bent down, ducked under the tent flap, and felt his jaw drop. He had walked into what looked like an old-fashioned 3-room flat, complete with bathroom and kitchen. Oddly enough, it was furnished in exactly the same sort of style as Miss Fig's house. There were crocheted covers on the mismatched chairs and a strong smell of cats.
Well, it's not for long,
said Mr. Weasley, mopping his bald pouch with a handkerchief and peering in at the 4 bunk beds that stood in the bedroom.
I borrowed this from Perkins at the office. Doesn't camp much anymore, poor fellow. He's got lumbago.
He picked up the dusty kettle and peered inside it.
We'll need water.
There's a tap marked on this map that Muggle gave us,
said Ron, who had followed Harry inside the tent and seemed completely unimpressed by its extraordinary inner proportions.
It's on the other side of the field.
Well, why don't you, Harry, and Hermione go and get us some water then?
Mr. Weasley handed over the kettle and a couple of saucepans.
And the rest of us will get some wood for the fire.
But we've got an oven,
said Ron.
Why can't we just...
Ron, anti-Muggle security,
said Mr. Weasley, his face shining with anticipation.
When real Muggles camp, they cook on fires outdoors. I've seen them at it.
After a quick tour of the girls' tent, which was slightly smaller than the boys', though without the smell of cats, Harry, Ron, and Hermione set off across the campsite with the kettle and saucepans. Now, with the sun newly risen and the mist lifting, they could see the city of tents that stretched in every direction. They made their way slowly through the rows, staring eagerly around. It was only just dawning on Harry how many witches and wizards there must be in the world. He had never really thought much about those in other countries. Their fellow campers were starting to wake up. First to stir were the families with small children. Harry had never seen witches and wizards this young before. A tiny boy, no older than 2, was crouched outside a large pyramid-shaped tent, holding a wand and poking happily at a slug in the grass, which was swelling slowly to the size of a salami. As they drew level with him, his mother came hurrying out of the tent.
How many times, Kevin? You don't touch Daddy's wand. Yuck!
She had trodden on the giant slug, which burst. Her scolding carried after them on the still air, mingling with the little boy's yells.
You bust slug! You bust slug!
A short way further on, they saw 2 little witches, barely older than Kevin, who were riding toy broomsticks that rose only high enough for the girls' toes to skim the dewy grass. A ministry wizard had already spotted them. As he hurried past Harry, Ron, and Hermione, he muttered distractedly.
In
Broad
broad
daylight.
daylight.
Parents having a lion, I suppose.
Here and there, adult wizards and witches were emerging from their tents and starting to cook breakfast. Some, with furtive looks around them, conjured fires with their wands. Others were striking matches with dubious looks on their faces, as though sure this couldn't work. 3 African wizards sat in serious conversation, all of them wearing long white robes, and roasting what looked like a rabbit on a bright purple fire, while a group of middle-aged American witches sat gossiping happily beneath a spangled banner stretched between their tents that read, "The Salem Witches Institute." Harry caught snatches of conversation in strange languages from the inside of the tents they passed, and though he couldn't understand a word, the tone of every voice was excited.
Is it my eyes, or has everything gone green?
Said Ron. It wasn't just Ron's eyes. They had walked into a patch of tents that were all covered with a thick growth of shamrocks, so that it looked as though a small, oddly shaped hillocks had sprouted out of the earth. Grinning faces could be seen under those that had their flaps open. Then from behind them they heard their names.
Harry! Ron! Hermione!
It was Seamus Finnegan, their fellow Gryffindor 4th year. He was sitting in front of his own shamrock-covered tent with a sandy-haired woman, who had to be his mother, and his best friend Dean Thomas, also of Gryffindor.
Like the decorations?
Said Seamus, grinning.
The ministry's not too happy.
Aye, why shouldn't we show our colours?
Said Mrs. Finnegan.
You should see what the Bulgarians have got dangling over their tents. You'll be supporting Ireland, of course.
She added, eyeing Harry, Ron, and Hermione beadily. When they assured her that they were indeed supporting Ireland, they set off again, though, as Ron said,
Like we'd say anything else surrounded by that lot.
I wonder what the Bulgarians have got dangling all over their tents,
said Hermione.
Let's go and have a look.
Said Harry, pointing to a large patch of tents upfield where the Bulgarian flag, white, green, and red, was fluttering in the breeze. The tents here had not been bedecked with plant life, but each and every one of them had the same poster attached to it, a poster of a very surly face with heavy black eyebrows. The picture was, of course, moving, but all it did was blink and scowl.
Crumb.
Said Ron quietly.
What?
Said Hermione.
Crumb.
Said Ron.
Victor Crumb, the Bulgarian seeker.
He looks really grumpy,
said Hermione, looking around at the many crumbs blinking and scowling at them.
Really grumpy?
Ron raised his eyes to the heavens.
Who cares what he looks like? He's unbelievable. He's really young, too. Only just 18 or something. He's a genius. You wait until tonight, you'll see.
There was already a small queue for the tap in the corner of the field. Harry, Ron, and Hermione joined it, right behind a pair of men who were having a heated argument. One of them was a very old wizard who was wearing a long flowery nightgown. The other was clearly a ministry wizard. He was holding out a pair of pinstripe trousers and almost crying with exasperation.
Just put them on, Archie. There's a good chap. You can't walk around like that. The muggle at the gate's already suspicious.
I bought this in a muggle shop.
Said the old wizard stubbornly.
Muggles wear them.
Muggle women wear them, Archie, not the men. You wear these. Said
the ministry wizard, and he brandished the pinstripe trousers.
I'm not putting them on,
said old Archie in indignation.
I like a healthy breeze round my privates, thanks.
Hermione was overcome with such a strong fit of the giggles at this moment that she had to duck out of the queue. Thank you. And only returned when Archie had collected his water and moved away. Walking more slowly now because of the weight of the water, they made their way back through the campsite. Here and there, they saw more familiar faces. Other Hogwarts students with their families. Oliver Wood, the old captain of Harry's house Quidditch team, who had just left Hogwarts, dragged Harry over to his parents' tent to introduce him and told him excitedly he had just been signed to the Puddlemere United reserve team. They were hailed by Ernie McMallan, a Pufflepuff 4th year, And a little further on, they saw Cho Chang, a very pretty girl who played seeker on the Ravenclaw team. She waved and smiled at Harry, who slopped quite a lot of water down his front as he waved back. More to stop Ron from smirking than anything, Harry hurriedly pointed out a large group of teenagers whom he'd never seen before.
Harry.
Who do you reckon they are?
He said.
They don't go to Hogwarts, do they?
Expect they go to some foreign school.
Said Ron.
I know there are others. Never met anyone who went to one, though. Bill had a pen friend at a school in Brazil. This was years and years ago. And he wanted to go on an exchange trip, but Mom and Dad couldn't afford it. His pen friend got all offended when he said he wasn't going and sent him a cursed hat. It made his ears shrivel up.
Harry laughed, but didn't voice the amazement he felt at hearing about other wizarding schools. He supposed now that he saw representatives of so many nationalities in the campsite that he had been stupid to never realize that Hogwarts couldn't be the only one. He glanced at Hermione, who looked utterly unsurprised by the information. No doubt she had run across the news about other wizarding schools in some book or other.
You've been ages,
said George when they finally got back to the Weasleys' tents.
A few people?
Said Ron, setting the water down.
You not got that fire started yet? Dad's having fun with the matches,
said Fred. Mr. Weasley was having no success at all in lighting the fire, but it wasn't for lack of trying. Splintered matches littered the ground around him, but he looked as though he was having the time of his life.
Oops,
he said as he managed to light a match and promptly dropped it in surprise.
Come here, Mr. Weasley,
said Hermione kindly, taking the box from him and showing him how to do it properly. At last they got the fire lit, though it was at least another hour before it was hot enough to cook anything. There was plenty to watch while they waited, however. Their tent seemed to be pitched right alongside a kind of thoroughfare to the field, and Ministry members kept hurrying up and down it, greeting Mr. Weasley cordially as they passed. Mr. Weasley kept up a running commentary, mainly for Harry's and Hermione's benefit. His own children knew too much about the Ministry to be greatly interested.
That was Colbert Mockridge, head of the Goblin Liaison Office. Here comes Gilbert Wimple. He was with the Committee on Experimental Charms. He's had those horns for a while now. Hello, Arnold Peasgood. He's an Obliviator, member of the Accidental Magic Reversal Squad. You know, and that's Bodhi and Croaker. They're unspeakables.
The what?
From the Department of Mysteries. Top secret. No idea what they get up to.
At last the fire was ready, and they had just started cooking eggs and sausages when Bill, Charlie, and Percy came strolling out of the wood toward them.
Just apparated, Dad,
said Percy loudly.
Ah, excellent. Lunch.
They were halfway through their plates of eggs and sausages when Mr. Weasley jumped to his feet, waving and grinning at the man who was striding toward them.
Ha!
He said.
The man of the moment, Ludo!
Ludo Bagman was easily the most noticeable person Harry had seen so far, even including old Archie in his flowered nightdress. He was wearing long Quidditch robes and thick horizontal stripes of bright yellow and black. An enormous picture of a wasp was splashed across his chest. He had the look of a powerfully built man gone slightly to seed. The robes were stretched tightly across a large belly he surely had not had in the days when he played Quidditch for England. His nose was squashed, probably broken by a stray bludger, Harry thought. But his round blue eyes, short blonde hair, and rosy complexion made him look like a very overgrown schoolboy.
Ahoy there!
Bagman called happily. He was walking as though he had springs attached to the balls of his feet and was plainly in a state of wild excitement.
Arthur, old man.
He puffed as he reached the campfire.
What a day, eh? What a day. Could he have asked for a more perfect weather? A cloudless night coming, and hardly a hiccup in the arrangement. Not much for me to do.
Behind him, a group of haggard-looking Ministry wizards rushed past, pointing at the distant evidence of some sort of magical fire that was sending violet sparks 20 feet into the air. Percy hurried forward with his hand outstretched. Apparently, his disapproval of the way Ludo Bagman ran his department did not prevent him from wanting to make a good impression.
Ah, yes.
Mr. Weasley said, grinning.
This is my son Percy. He just started with the ministry. And this is Fred. No, George. Sorry, that's Fred. Bill, Charlie, Ron, my daughter Ginny, and Ron's friend Hermione Granger and Harry Potter.
Bagman did the smallest double takes when he heard Harry's name, and his eyes performed the familiar flick upward to the scar on Harry's forehead.
Everyone,
Mr. Weasley continued.
this is Ludo Bagman. You know who he is. It's thanks to him we got such good tickets.
Bagman beamed and waved his hand as if to say it had been nothing.
Fancy a flat on the match, Arthur?
He said eagerly, jingling what seemed to be a large amount of gold in the pockets of his black and yellow robes.
I've already got Roddy Pontner betting me Bulgaria will score first. I offered him nice odds, considering Ireland's front three are the strongest I've seen in years. And little Agatha Timms has put up half shares in her eel farm on a week-long match.
Oh, go on then.
Said Mr. Weasley.
Let's see. Galleon on Ireland to win.
A galleon.
Ludo Bagman looked slightly disappointed, but recovered himself.
Very well, very well. Any other takers?
They're a bit young to be gambling.
Said Mr. Weasley.
Molly wouldn't like.
We'll bet 37 galleons, 15 sickles, 3 nuts.
Said Fred as he and George quickly pooled all their money.
That Ireland wins, but Victor Crumb gets the snitch. Oh, and we'll throw in a fake wand.
You don't want to go showing Mr. Bagman rubbish like that.
Percy hissed, but Bagman didn't seem to think the wand was rubbish at all. On the contrary, his boyish face shone with excitement as he took it from Fred, and when the wand gave a loud squawk and turned into a rubber chicken, Bagman roared with laughter.
Excellent! I haven't seen one that convincing in years. I'd pay 5 galleons for that.
Percy froze in an attitude of stunned disapproval.
Boys,
said Mr. Weasley under his breath.
I don't want you betting. That's all your savings, your mother.
Don't be a spoil sport, Arthur.
Boomed Ludo Bagman, rattling his pockets excitedly.
They're old enough to know what they want. You reckon Ireland will win, but Crumb will get the snitch? Not a chance, boy, not a chance. I'll give you excellent odds on that one. We'll add 5 galleons for the funny wand. Then, shall we?
Mr. Weasley looked on helplessly as Ludo Bagman whipped out a notebook and quill and began jotting down the twins' names.
Cheers,
said George, taking the slip of parchment Bagman handed him and tucking it away into the front of his robes. Bagman turned most cheerfully back to Mr. Weasley.
That's Bagman.
Couldn't do me a brew, I suppose. I'm keeping an eye out for Barty Crouch. My Bulgarian opposite numbers making difficulties, and I can't understand a word he's saying. Barty will be able to sort it out. He speaks about 150 languages. Mr. Crouch?
Said Percy, suddenly abandoning his look of poker-stiff disapproval and positively writhing with excitement.
He speaks over 200, Mermish and Gobbledygook and Troll.
Anyone can speak troll.
Said Fred dismissively.
All you have to do is point and grunt.
Percy threw Fred an extremely nasty look and stoked the fire vigorously to bring the kettle back to the boil.
Any news of Bertha Jenkins yet, Ludo?
Mr. Weasley added as Bagman settled himself down on the grass beside them all.
Not a dicky bird.
Said Bagman uncomfortably.
But she'll turn up. Poor old Bertha. Memory like a leaky cauldron and no sense of direction. Lost. You take my word for it. She'll wander back into the office sometime in October, thinking it's still July.
You don't think it might be time to send someone to look for her?
Mr. Weasley suggested tentatively as Percy handed Bagman his tea.
Barty Crouch keeps saying that.
Said Bagman, his round eyes widening innocently.
But she really can't spare anyone at the moment. Oh, talk of the devil. Barty!
A wizard had just apparated at their fireside, and he could not have made more of a contrast with Ludo Bagman, sprawled on the grass in his old wasp robes. Barty Crouch was a stiff, upright, elderly man, dressed in an impeccably crisp suit and tie. The parting in his short gray hair was almost unnaturally straight, and his narrow toothbrush mustache looked as though he had trimmed it using a side rule. His shoes were very highly polished. Harry could see at once why Percy idolized him. Percy was a great believer in rigidly following the rules, and Mr. Crouch had complied with the rule about muggle dressing so thoroughly that he could have passed for a bank manager. Harry doubted even Uncle Vernon would have spotted him for what he really was.
Pull up a bit of grass, Barty,
said Ludo brightly, patting the ground beside him.
No, thank you, Ludo,
said Crouch, and there was a bite of impatience in his voice.
I've been looking for you everywhere. The Bulgarians are insisting we add another 12 seats to the top box.
Oh, is that what they're after?
said Bagman.
I thought the chap was asking to borrow a pair of tweezers. Bit of a strong accent. Mr. Crouch,
said Percy breathlessly, sunk into a kind of half bow that made him look like a hunchback.
Would you like a cup of tea?
Oh?
said Mr. Crouch, looking over at Percy in mild surprise.
Yes, thank you, Weatherby.
Fred and George choked into their own cups. Percy, very pink around the ears, busied himself with the kettle.
Oh, and I've been wanting a word. Oh no, that's Mr. Crouch.
Oh, and I've been wanting a word with you too, Arthur,
said Mr. Crouch, his sharp eyes falling upon Mr. Weasley.
Ali Bashir's on the warpath. He wants a word with you about your embargo on flying carpets.
Mr. Weasley heaved a deep sigh.
I sent him an owl about that just last week. If I've told him once, I've told him 100 times. Carpets are defined as a Muggle artifact by the Registry of Prescribed Charmable Objects. But will he listen?
I doubt it,
said Mr. Crouch, accepting a cup from Percy.
He's desperate to export here.
Well, they'll never replace brooms in Britain, will they?
said Bagman.
Ali thinks there's a niche in the market for a family vehicle,
said Mr. Crouch.
I remember my grandfather had an Axminster that could seat 12, but that was before carpets were banned, of course.
He spoke as though he wanted to leave nobody in any doubt that all his ancestors had abided strictly by the law.
So, been keeping busy up, Barty?
said Bagman breezily.
Fairly,
said Mr. Crouch dryly.
Organizing port keys across 5 continents is no mere feat, Ludo.
I expect you'll both be glad when this is over,
said Mr. Weasley. Ludo Bagman looked shocked.
Is that Ludo?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Glad. Don't know when I've had more fun. Still, it's not as though we haven't got anything to look forward to, eh, Barty? Eh? Plenty left to organize, eh?
Mr. Crouch raised his eyebrows at Bagman.
We agreed not to make the announcement until all the details.
Oh, details.
said Bagman, waving the word away like a cloud of midges.
They've signed, haven't they? They've agreed, haven't they? I bet you anything these kids will know soon enough anyway. I mean, it's happening at Hogwarts.
Ludo, we need to meet the Bulgarians, you know,
said Mr. Crouch sharply, cutting Bagman's remark short.
Thank you for the tea, Weatherby.
He pushed his undrunk tea back at Percy and waited for Ludo to rise. Bagman struggled to his feet, swigging down the last of his tea, the gold in his pockets clinking merrily.
See you all later,
he said.
You'll be up in the top box with me. I'm commentating.
He waved. Barty Crouch nodded curtly. Both of them disapparated.
What's happening at Hogwarts, Dad?
said Fred at once.
What were they talking about?
You'll find out soon enough,
said Mr. Weasley, smiling.
Percy.
It's classified information until such time as the Ministry decides to release it.
said Percy stiffly.
Mr. Crouch was quite right not to disclose it.
Oh, shut up, Weatherby.
said Fred. A sense of excitement rose like a palpable cloud over the campsite as the afternoon wore on. By dusk, the still summer air itself seemed to be quivering with anticipation, and as darkness spread like a curtain over the thousands of waiting wizards, the last vestiges of pretense disappeared. The ministry seemed to have bowed to the inevitable and stopped fighting the signs of blatant magic now breaking out everywhere. Salesmen were apparating every few feet, carrying trays and pushing carts full of extraordinary merchandise. There were luminous rosettes, green for Ireland, red for Bulgaria, which were squealing the names of the players, pointed green hats bedecked with dancing shamrocks, Bulgarian scarves adorned with lions that really roared, flags from both countries that played their national anthems as they were waved. There were tiny models of firebolts that really flew, and collectible figures of famous players, which strolled across the palm of your hand, preening themselves.
Been saving my pocket money all summer for this.
Ron told Harry as they and Hermione strolled through the salesmen, buying souvenirs. Though Ron purchased a dancing shamrock hat and a large green rosette, he also bought a small figure of Victor Crumb, the Bulgarian seeker. The miniature Crumb walked backward and forward over Ron's hand, scowling up at the green rosette above him.
Wow, look at these,
said Harry, hurrying over to a cart piled high with what looked like brass binoculars, except that they were covered in all sorts of weird knobs and dials.
Omnioculars.
Said the sales wizard eagerly.
You can replay action, slow everything down, and they flash up a play-by-play breakdown if you need it. Bargain, 10 galleons each.
Wish I hadn't bought this now,
said Ron, gesturing at his dancing shamrock hat and gazing longingly at the binoculars.
3 pairs,
said Harry firmly to the wizard.
No, don't bother,
said Ron, going red. He was always touchy about the fact Harry, who had inherited a small fortune from his parents, had much more money than he did.
You won't be getting anything for Christmas,
Harry told him, thrusting binoculars into his and Hermione's hands.
For about 10 years, mine.
Fair enough,
said Ron, grinning.
Ooh, thanks, Harry.
Said Hermione.
And I'll get us some programs. Look!
Their money bags considerably lighter, they went back to the tents. Bill, Charlie, and Ginny were all sporting green rosettes too, and Mr. Weasley was carrying an Irish flag. Fred and George had no souvenirs as they had given Bagman all their gold. And then a deep, booming gong sounded everywhere beyond the woods, and at once green and red lanterns blazed into life in the trees, lighting a path to the field.
It's time,
said Mr. Weasley, looking as excited as any of them.
Come on, let's go.
And that's where we're going to stop. right before the Quidditch World Cup will start, we will stop. Thank you all so much. We wish you all a happy Friday, Shabbat Shalom, a great weekend. Hopefully the air is going to get better. Those fires are going to get contained. Stay safe, stay inside, and we hopefully will see you soon, but not too soon. Bye, everyone. See you later.
Bye, everyone.